So I'm going to, in part, respond to and expand upon some of the things that these terrific panelists have said and add a few twists of my own. I'll start with this. We're talking about an age of polarization, political polarization, which is undeniably true. But to some degree, to echo what Leo said, the problem is not polarization. You can have policy that's made, and pretty good policy that's made, even if you have actors who are highly partisan and polarized in ideological terms. I wrote a column a few months back on upon the announcement of the retirement of Henry Waxman. Henry was not a centrist. He wouldn't have said he was a centrist. Nobody would have said he was a centrist. He was a proud liberal and a partisan Democrat. But if you look at the record of accomplishment, whether you like the policies or not, 40 years in the House, his fingerprints were all over every single piece of healthcare legislation, environmental legislation, and a whole lot of other things. And he would tell you, and it was accurate, that his biggest accomplishments and proudest accomplishments came while Ronald Reagan was president. He cut deals, he found ways to get into the seams, to give a little and get a little, to use his leverage. And when you step back from it, the eighth of a loaf he got here, or the quarter of a loaf he got there, made a pretty robust loaf of bread with Medicare, with Medicaid, and a whole host of other areas. You could look at the partnership between Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy that resulted in, among other things, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Again, not two figures of the center working together. So polarization itself does not mean that you can't make good policy or make progress on policy, or you lead inevitably to gridlock. The problem we have now is, as others have suggested, and I'll use the term, tribalism. This is actors who believe that the other side are evil, are the enemy and not the adversary. And if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And we have a lot of examples of that. And I don't want to be apocalyptic, but I want to reflect on a couple of things that make this particularly troubling for me as I look down the road. Of course, it's that kind of viewpoint that leads to what Abramowitz and Webster said, what Rui mentioned, which is negative partisanship, that you're motivated more by your distaste for the others. There was a survey just a few days ago that showed that the proportion of Americans who identify as Christians is declining, while the proportion of those who identify as secular, non-religious, or have a different religion is rising. You've probably seen the famous Bill O'Reilly diatribes against the war on Christmas, which the entire Fox News network supported, and you may have been more likely to see Jon Stewart skewering them. You have perhaps heard Mike Huckabee, and you will hear others, Ted Cruz among them, basically talking about how we are now in a war against Christianity in this country. Now take partisan tribalism and layer in an increasing religious animosity or a component, a group of people who have been the dominant force in the society declining in their power, and it's combustible. Then focus on the other reality, and Rui talked about the white working class. Democrats have lost support among white working class voters, and they have a challenge with college-educated whites in many cases. The Republican Party, in significant part, though not exclusively, because of not just the position but the rhetoric used on immigration issues, which is effectively, we don't want your kind here, have increasingly walled themselves off from getting more support from minority voters. So we're moving towards having one party that is predominantly a white party and the other party that is dominated by minority voters at a time when minority population is increasing about 2% every year. Throw in an enhanced race factor, and obviously you can see how that's played out in the years of the Obama presidency, with starker racist terminology used to characterize the president, and now with some of the divisions that we see in perceptions and on the streets, whether it's Ferguson or Baltimore or other places. Throw in a racial component in a heightened way to partisan tribalism. And we've got a problem, folks, that's going to get much worse. And we are not immune from the kind of sectarianism that has hit many other societies. So this is troubling beyond the questions of whether we can somehow make reasonable educational policy or solve our economic dilemmas or even deal with the huge problem of inequality and growing inequality. There are other factors here that we're going to have to deal with. Now I've got your attention. Let me throw in a few other things. Rui mentioned the asymmetric polarization, which is clearly the case, and we have lots of data to support it. And one of the problems that exists out there now is that there is no penalty for a party that moves off the rails. I would recommend something else for you to read, which is a very powerful piece by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson in the newest issue of the American Prospect, which is basically why radical Republicans have paid no price for obstructionist policies. And a part of the reason there is we have a mass media that cannot and will not go away from the notion of false equivalence, that it's everybody's fault, that everybody's equally to blame. And if you are in a mainstream media world where your revenue is declining and your audience is declining and your advertising is declining, you're going to fall back on that refuge because you do not want to be known as biased, given the space you're trying to occupy, and because it violates all of your own internal norms anyhow. So there's no price to be paid. But the other reality of the asymmetric polarization is it's not what we typically think of as polarization, where you move from the center towards the left or the right. In this case, we're not looking at moving from the center to the right. We're looking at a party that has moved from the right to the radical right. There is no more center with the exception of a trace element of people. The ages-long struggle, both parties have had them, between a pragmatic centrist base and an ideological movement, it's different now. For more than a century, it was a progressive movement on the Republican side, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, battling against the conservative forces led by William Howard Taft. Then it was the progressive forces of Robert La Follette, battling against the establishment but very conservative forces of Robert Taft, who then had to battle the establishment, moderate and liberal forces of Tom Dewey and Wendell Willkie. And then we moved through iterations with Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, who kind of fused all of the groups together. But now the people we would have considered on the right of the Republican Party are the establishment figures who are now viewed to be the center. And they're battling forces who are off in a very different place. The conservatives, and you look at some of these figures who are being attacked from the right, who 20 years ago we would have seen as almost over on the fringe themselves, and they fit a more traditional pattern. They want a smaller, leaner, meaner government. They want budget balance. The radical forces want to blow the whole damn thing up. And the belief is if any part of government works, that's bad because people are going to like it, and if they like it, they're going to want more of it. And that also adds into it some of the darker forces that Richard Hofstadter wrote about that are now encouraged even more by the tribal media and the social media that reinforce them. And that creates a real problem, including a problem for those who are trying to be pragmatic and create a competitive party at all levels from the presidential on down. Now, there are a couple of components here that have led to the kind of divisions that we've had in the Obama years, many of which were heralded in the precursor times of Bill Clinton as president. One part of it is a ruthless pragmatism. We live in an age where the party divisions are close enough, as Rui to some degree suggested, that in any given election, you think you can win, or at least you can come close to winning a majority. And it's the era of the permanent campaign, where there's no focus on governing as a separate time or act, where you try to build the coalitions that have traditionally been a part of the American constitutional system. Working with somebody on the other side, pragmatically, much of the time, is going to be to your detriment. And you can see very specifically in the words of Mitch McConnell over the first Obama term what that plays out as in terms of ruthless pragmatism. One, the famous phrase, our number one goal is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. When I first heard that, I thought, well, I must have misheard or Mitch misspoke. Clearly, what he meant to say was our number one goal is to get the economy moving, to educate our citizens to prepare for competing in the global economy, and to accomplish that goal. But no, he cut right to the chase. Even more, though, was what he said in the aftermath of the 2010 midterm elections, the stunning Republican success, the backlash against bickering politics and a view that many of the actions had been illegitimately taken. And McConnell spoke to Politico and he said, well, of course we weren't going to cooperate with Obama, because if we had and those policies had passed, they would have had the patina of legitimacy of being bipartisan. People liked him. He would have gained. We would have suffered. That's ruthless pragmatism. Then you throw in the tribal and ideological factor, because part of that ruthless pragmatism, if you look towards the onset of the 2010 election campaign, we had the famous young guns, Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy. They did a book, and more important, they had a blueprint. They went out around the country and recruited people by fueling the flames of the anger against the illegitimacy of the Obama administration. And it was right for that moment, because in the aftermath of the financial collapse, the bailout, the populism that emerged, you could have a Tea Party movement emerging from the grassroots and elites exploiting it to get candidates who could win. And their idea was, now we've got them, we've got the majority, we co-opt them. Well, they have become the co-optees, not the co-optors. And now what you have is a very different dynamic in the Republican Party, especially in the aftermath of the equal success fueled by the same kinds of angry responses and the same flames of the 2014 midterm elections that brought them a majority in the Senate to go along with the majority, enhanced majority in the House. And in the immediate aftermath of that election, the pragmatism that emerged from Mitch McConnell and young gun Kevin McCarthy was, well, now we've got both houses of Congress, we have to show we can govern. So there'll be no more threats of shutdown, much less shutdowns themselves. There'll be no more playing around with the debt ceiling. We're going to pass all kinds of policies to show our agenda. Either the president will be forced to his knees to sign them because look at the mandate we've gotten, or he will veto them and then we can take that to the American people. So what happens? The first thing that happens is the speaker, who helped to bring about a stunning result, gaining even more Republicans after huge gains in 2010 and keeping their majorities in 2012, gets more than 25 of his own colleagues voting against him because he is insufficiently radical for them. We get a near shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. We have a budget that is leading us towards shutdowns in October, at least of portions of the government. And we now have Mitch McConnell pushed by his right saying, well, we're going to try and use the debt ceiling again to extract something out of it. And that may be ending the individual mandate. There may be a whole lot of things that will emerge from that. While at the same time, they have struggled to pass even pieces of legislation that their ruthless pragmatism blocked directly, like the human trafficking bill, before the last election because they didn't want that, even though there was a broad consensus of the need, victory for the president or the Democratic Party before that crucial election. And it still took them weeks to manage to get that piece of legislation through. And now they're faced with the continuing pressure of that activist anger that itself is amplified by the fact that presidential candidates are appealing to what is now the dominant force in the Republican side, the primary and caucus electorate, that are dominated by radicals. And for Mitch McConnell, who's got 54 Republicans in the Senate, 3 of them running for president, all abandoning their fundamental principles, including things that they believed in before, whether it's Marco Rubio and his signature accomplishment in the Senate, his immigration bill, or other candidates outside the Congress who have, like Bobby Jindal, dropped their ardent support for Common Core to now suggest that it would be the biggest step leading to a socialist or communist state, creating real problems for him moving forward. Now, with that kind of tension, we are seeing some interesting things happen out there, including the fact that reauthorization of ESEA that Danielle talked about passed the Senate Help Committee unanimously. Whatever problems there are in that piece of legislation, Lamar Alexander, who has been a pragmatist in the past, but who went along with the strategy of filibustering everything and was a ruthless pragmatist himself and a lieutenant of Mitch McConnell, now wearing a different hat as a chairman trying to accomplish something, went around and got a lot of liberal Democrats doing his trade-offs. And this was not, again, a move of the center. Alexander is very much a conservative Republican, but managed to pull together Democrats and Republicans to get that bill through his committee. Now, he did it in part by shutting off amendments. Many of those amendments, which include very radical amendments, are going to be coming up on the Senate floor again. And in any event, the House committee, under the tutelage of John Klein, is not at all likely to go along with any of the things that were in that bill, and whatever they do come up with in the House would be opposed by most Democrats in the Senate and likely filibustered in any case, making a lot of these moves appear to have small numbers of green shoots if you're looking for some kind of policy, including the long-delayed reauthorization of an important piece of legislation. But don't leave anybody, or at least don't leave me, feeling as if we've somehow broken a fever here and are moving towards pragmatic policy making. And then let me just add a couple of other factors. Danielle talked a lot about moving out to the states. What's happened in the states is that tribalism has metastasized and radical ideology out to a whole large number of states. You only have to look as far down the East Coast as Florida, where we have Rick Scott, the governor, who's decided that he wants federal money for Medicaid. But if the term Obamacare is in any way within the vicinity of the neighborhood of the location of that money, he will not take it. And as a consequence, he is now moving to scuttle his plans for more tax cuts and for more money for education in the state. So an ideology which is anti-Obama trumps even tax cuts right now, which tells you how tribal things have gotten. And then you could go to Kansas, where Sam Brownback has a philosophy of governing, and even in the face of overwhelming pragmatic evidence that it is causing the state to fall apart, he will not abandon tax cuts and is cutting education, which has been cut to the bone, even further, and will completely eviscerate the educational system in Kansas. So there are other examples that may move in a different direction, but the fact is that the tribalism is not being leached from our system, and because it's now so much a part of the culture, simple structural reforms, while necessary, are not going to create a big difference in the short term, and something more radical may be required. Now, if I could do one thing that is within the realm of reason, it would be to pass a package of things that would make voting easier, that at least would move some of the incentives away from the more radical forces. And we've done a couple of things out there that have some promise, including the open primaries. If we combine that with preference voting, we might get somewhere. redistricting commissions that have created a little bit more heterogeneity in some of these districts, although we're now awaiting a Supreme Court decision that may blow up the whole notion of citizens being able to recapture control over the redistricting process. But I think we may need to look at something more sweeping, and that would include a House that is not simply composed of single-member districts, that, redistricting aside, because of the natural residential patterns and the big sort that Bill Bishop wrote about, are going to continue to be homogeneous in nature, and given the nature of mass media, homogeneous echo chambers. So multi-member districts, or maybe even some version of the German system where you have 100 members elected at large along with those single-member districts, is something we have to at least inject into the stream of discussion, even though it's not likely to happen for many decades to come. And along with that, we're going to have to get, I think, a very different dialogue in the country to avoid what could be a much, much greater division with partisan tribalism, religious division, and the racial divide, all combining together in a very toxic way.